Let's talk.
John Brown.
AIDS in Soviet Russia is a story of deception, despair, and hope. For the first time in English, this book is here to tell the extraordinary story of the AIDS crisis in Soviet Russia. If you know, I have spoken several times to Peter Tatchell, of course, who is a prominent, former MP, human rights campaigner, and he has called this book a profoundly shocking expose. I'm delighted to say that joining me live on the line is the author of AIDS in Soviet Russia. He is Rustam Alexander. Rustam, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure is mine. We don't think, for those of us who grew up, as I did, as a teenager stroke young man in the 80s in the UK, there was a huge campaign, Terence Higgins Trust, AIDS Don't Die of Ignorance. It was front and center of all our, if you like, our sexual lifestyle during the 1980s stroke 1990s. And I had never actually, until I saw your press notes landed on my desk, I hadn't even considered the fact that there was an AIDS crisis in the Soviet Union, because it was a very different situation.
Yes, it was a very different situation in many respects, and it was very different. And there were no public campaigns talking about the need to talk about, like sex education or raising awareness about AIDS. Basically, the Soviet society was just trying to survive. As you know, in 1985, Gorbachev started perestroika, and all the issues that had been so far hidden and not discussed, they burst out into the open. And then somehow the AIDS epidemic, which was raging in the world, it coincided with this, very tumultuous sort of like period of Russian history. And people started talking about AIDS and HIV. But first they were kind of like blaming, like this usual discourse. Yeah, that's the disease of homosexual people and prostitutes and
decadent Western liberals.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes, there was that argument. And then, honestly, I think that Russian Soviet officials back then, they sincerely believed that somehow the Soviet Union was just immune to that thing. But they were proven wrong in 1988, in late 1988, when there was a huge outbreak in one of Russia's hospitals, which infected almost 270 infants, and they were all infected via, poorly sterilized, blood transfusions and syringes. So that's when the government realized that this problem was real. It was not about those undesirables. It was about the whole Soviet system, which was not able to protect its own citizens, and most importantly, its most vulnerable citizens, like little kids. So it was about survival rather than, let's educate people. Survival was the story everywhere, but in Russia, it was like Russians were taken aback.
Because the thing, I suppose one of the things is with the former Soviet Union is that we have this, and we talk now in the West of toxic masculinity. Okay, we talk about the image. It's not having to. You can argue that the Soviet Union, because there are two levels. There is what the high level of the Soviet Union wants us to believe, i.e., the perfect Soviet man, the perfect Soviet woman, the family, blah 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 blah. And this is a decadent Western disease, and we won't have them because we have Soviet virtues. But at the same time, if you look at the health service in the Soviet Union, if you look, listen, it's better than they're better than it was, but it's still. It is not perfect. You look at the drug problem in the Soviet Union. You've got guys coming back from Afghanistan as well, pretty much Soviet troops. They've got problems with needles and syringes and whatever with that. The quality of life and the problems. That we already now know of the huge problems with alcoholism, domestic violence that happens in Soviet Union, and so these are fertile conditions on that level for the spread of AIDS. And again, the macho culture, we don't use this sort of contraception because we need more babies because it's the Soviet Union, the motherland, the father, whatever. So this is a breeding ground for an explosion. And because of the way the Soviet Union reacts, like a glacier rather than quick, by the time they realize what's going on, it's already too late, Rustam.
Exactly, yes. And there was one more thing that provided this fertile ground. It was the Soviet Union's inability to talk about things honestly and to be candid about things that had always existed in society. For example, drug addiction. Like the Soviet Union was really adamant to the idea of giving, people suffering from that, clean syringes, like to prevent the disease from happening. There were many issues that all of a sudden the Soviet Union had to discuss publicly, and officials were not ready for that. People were not ready for that. And that was indeed something that contributed a lot to this unfolding epidemic, because people were they were struggling to make sense of what was happening. So too many issues that they had to address in a very short period of time. That was, and as you've noted as well, there were other things that contributed to that. So it was a whole, shattering reversal of everything that the Soviet Union had been. And then they had to sort of make sense of it, deal with many, many other issues, because remember, it was a huge country which was falling apart. There were so many issues, and AIDS was just not on the list of priorities due to many things, including political, social, the perceptions that you have, mentioned. So all of these things, unfortunately, they all coincided and made the issue more problematic. But yes, the Soviet Union had some time to observe what was happening in the West. Instead of that, Soviet officials chose complacency and just this hope that it would never happen. But it did.
And here is a really stupid statement, so prepare yourself. But the Soviet Union is a massive country. I mean, it is several countries and cultures. And so therefore, we tend to think, because, hey, we're in Europe, of Soviet Union being Moscow, St. Petersburg, etc. But of course, you have all the stands. At this point, you have Uzbekistan, you have all the other nations. And so for a centralized health system to move, again, with the cultural, and I'm not just Soviet cultural boundaries, but, the cultural boundaries of an Uzbekistan, to discuss these issues and to act on these issues, is going to take years. And so, again, this facilitates the spread.
Yes, absolutely. And, the topic of my book is actually AIDS in Soviet Russia. My initial ambition was to talk about the story of AIDS in the whole Soviet Union. And then once I started working on the manuscript, I realized that it's just impossible to put it all together, because somehow Soviet authorities in 1917, they managed to, basically take all these pieces of land and put them all together in this, basically an amalgam of cultures and things and practices. And it was in this context that AIDS happened. And I realized that first of all, I didn't have the sources. Secondly, I just had very little knowledge about the AIDS situation in these countries. So I decided to focus on Soviet Russia and mainly its major cities. Probably it's one of the things that other scholars and writers might want to explore. But yes, as you have said, the situation is different, and it is very different even now. For example, in Uzbekistan, they still have sodomy laws, and the issue of AIDS and HIV is basically a taboo. So the incidence is very high, and the issue is not tackled.
In the West, as it were, we have the LGBTQ plus community is affected. That's on the front line. It's the people who have to become activists and take action. What is the situation like if you're a young gay man or gay woman growing up in the Soviet Union, and it's difficult enough already, and then this strikes?
Yeah, surprisingly, again, this issue has to be, explored further. But from what I found, Americans who were observing the situation in the USSR, they were thinking that actually the rate of infections among, for example, homosexual men and gay men was not very low. Was not as high as it was in the West, because Soviet gay men simply had no sort of places to meet, and do the things the way, for example, Western community was doing, because there was no sort of community in the USSR in this Western sense. There were no saunas, bathhouses, or clubs. So the transmission was very low because, compared to the West again. Because Soviet gay men couldn't do much. But then, as far as I understand, the situation kind of became worse. And then again, the epidemic, with this within this population was sort of like curtailed, and then the primary group, like the primary target of AIDS, was like people who were injecting drugs. So that is something that has to be researched. But in the Soviet Union, that was not a huge problem for gay community. Yes, they were aware of that problem. Yes, they were doing what they could, like the activists during Perestroika. But it was not as massive as it was in the States, for example. Yeah, and then again, it is something that I'm trying to sort of draw attention to in my book. That is a story that has many dimensions, like gay men, people who inject drugs, children, you name it. It's not just something. It's not like one thing that affects just one particular group.
We talk about, the whole thing was the misnomer where it was the gay plague. Right-wing Christian groups called it God's vengeance for lifestyles, etc. But then, of course, it strikes children, as you said before. It hits hospitals, and because of unhygienic practices, or they don't have the technology. They're not doing it deliberately, but it's just the way that unfortunately things are in hospitals, transfusions, syringes, etc. Who starts to notice this? And presumably this is going to be sort of repressed, pushed down. They're not going to say, they're not going to make it news. So is it always the actions of a few brave doctors and journalists and activists that just can see this happening and are trying to get this knowledge out to save lives?
Yes, I mean, the Soviet Union was notorious for trying to cover up things, huge, things like, for example, airplane crashes, outbreaks of, diseases. And it was so how this, for example, story about this hospital became known. So one of the doctors in Moscow, Vadim Pokrovsky, who is actually now is the number one guy, the number one specialist in Russia, who is still trying to sort of do something to prevent the epidemic from unfolding. So he accidentally found out, he came across a patient whose blood was infected. And then he started sort of, trying to track down the chain of transmission. And it brought him to that small town, Alista, in one of Russia's republics. And he went there and, he started testing all the kids and everything. And that's how he found out that there was a huge outbreak there. And local authorities, they, of course, tried to, cover things up. They were trying to say that there was no problem, and so they failed because the Perestroika and Glasnost were underway. But if it had happened, let's say 10 years earlier, if the Soviet Union didn't happen to be going through Gorbachev's Perestroika, this thing probably would have been hidden. And it wouldn't have come up to the, into the open. So it was fortunate in a way. Yeah, so it was about a group of brave individuals, and their stories needs to be told.
And how do they get the stories out there? I mean, because it's not like the West. I mean, do you go to Pravda? Do you send a press? I mean, you can't internet, can you? You can't social media. You've got that smile on your face, Rustam. Yeah. So how do they get the information out there? And again, this is
well, I've got a lot of experience researching these topics, and the idea to write this book actually came to me when I was writing my book, Red Closet. So these things were kind of intertwined. And then I was like, okay, I've got some sources that I found in Russia's archives 7 years ago when I could still go there and, find information. Then there are things that you can find in Europe. There are some archives, gay and lesbian archives where you can find all that information. Sometimes you can interview people as well. And fortunately, we are living in this digitized world where, books and journals and magazines are now available online. And fortunately, this moment in history was not too far, back. It was just 1980s. So it's relatively easy to find. But again, this is not the whole story. It needs to be told in more detail, and there are more things to explore.
I'm just wondering, because obviously you're not in Russia at the moment.
I'm not.
No, so we can have this conversation. But this is a sort of it's very sad, isn't it? Because you have the repression of the Soviet Union, then you have this period where it opens up, And if you were trying to tell this story again now, if you were in Russia, then you would probably find again it being Russia's gone back to, well, no, because the government says this is a decadent Western disease again, and so maybe we don't have the facts and figures of what the situation is at the moment.
Well, the situation is really bad at the moment. It's much worse than it was in the Soviet Union, and 500,000 people are being infected. 30,000 people are dying every year. Wow. I think the total number of HIV-infected people is like 1.5 million people. I mean, it's a very modest estimate because we still don't know about gay people who are hiding their diagnosis. We still don't know. People are just afraid to go to their doctors because, like in many places, in many clinics, doctors are now sort of like collaborating with the police. And it's really dangerous because, again, it's a very uncomfortable issue. The issues of morality come up. So people are aware of that. They do have this memory from the Soviet past, and they do understand that this is not just an illness. This is not just, it's not like syphilis. It's like a very politically charged thing that can be twisted any way, the authorities that would want. So, yes, the situation is much worse now. So what are you hoping that people will discover or learn from? Because this isn't the only book you've written. So this is obviously you're shining. And I applaud you for doing this, by the way, because that is the aim of journalism, is to put to shine a light on the places that people don't want you to shine a light. So what is the aim of your book, AIDS in Soviet Russia? Because you say it's hope as well. Yeah, exactly. Yes. I do have hope. So first of all, I just wanted to show that the story of AIDS and in Russia, it's not just a story about disease. This thing has many implications and dimensions. One of them is social, political, and there were human stories behind it. So one way to fight the epidemic is to understand that this is more than just, like a virus in someone's blood. It is about stigma. It is about discrimination. It's about, inhumane practices, all these kinds of things. I just wanted people to sort of it sounds maybe a little bit ridiculous, but I wanted them to look at this story from a very fresh perspective, to inspire them to write and learn more about it. And knowledge is power. Yeah. Break these sort of ignorant notions, replace them with credible narrative, and basically show them that, the only enemy is ignorance, basically. So that's one of the things that I was hoping to achieve. But yes, I would like to tell them the story. And honestly, I was fascinated by the people who were trying to prevent the epidemic from unfolding. So that was also one of my goals, to just show that the Soviet Union was not just sitting there, idly. Yes, much could have been done, but it wasn't. But yes, there was a story of, struggle against the epidemic in the Soviet Union. And I wanted people to know about it.
The book is called AIDS in the Soviet Union, a story of deception, despair and hope. It's by Rustam Alexander, who we're speaking to today. If people want to find you online or on social media, Rustam, is there a website in the socials? Where can they find you and continue the conversation?
Yeah, on X, also known as Twitter. It's a very modest, it has really modest following, but it's Ruskxander, Ruskxander, basically. Yeah. So, if people are interested, they can get in touch and ask questions, and I'm happy to answer.
Fabulous. Well, the book is called AIDS in Soviet Russia. It's by Rustam Alexander, who's speaking today. It's been an absolute eye-opener. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.